This series contains sexual references, adult themes, and depictions of violence. If these things are upsetting for you, please take care while you're listening.
From the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Bondi Badlands, proudly sponsored by ACON and Waverley Council. Episode 3, Blood City.
And they were just explosive in their activity, and they were pumped and just so energetic. It instantly reminded me of a Clockwork Orange.
He was lured to a discreet bushland location on that headland under the pretext of having sex with another male.
Welcome to Bondi Badlands, an investigation into a series of cliffside murders and mysterious disappearances in Sydney, Australia, in the late 1980s and early 1990s. I'm Greg Callaghan, author and deputy editor of Good Weekend magazine and the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. It's the clear, frosty night of Friday, July 20, 1990. Nearly 1 year to the day after Ross Warren vanished on the Tamarama side of the headland at Sydney's Bondi. 6 months after John Russell's bloodied and battered body was found at the bottom of the cliffs on the Bondi side. Inside a cramped and cosy living room in a rundown semi in Redfern, a bunch of street-hardened teenage boys are smoking bongs and downing beers. There's lots of boasting and one-upmanship. The mood darkens as the night wears on.
You should have seen this guy as being the maddest dickhead, so Keno just smacked the poof in the back of his head and he just took all his shit.
By midnight, brothers Sean and David McAuliffe and their mate Matthew Davis are spoiling for a fight. The two brothers boast to their mates they're going out to roll a poof. They frequently bash gaffs, as they call them, in the city, but their favourite late-night stomping ground is Marks Park at Bondi. 17-year-old Sean McAuliffe arms himself with a claw hammer. His 16-year-old brother David, satisfied with his fists alone, Matthew Davis grabs a pipe. They set off for the headland. Across town at Bondi, the restaurants and pubs along Campbell Parade are humming. In a Thai restaurant opposite the beach, 34-year-old Thai man Kritchikorn Rattanajurathaporn is finishing his shift. A slight man with big brown eyes, floppy black hair and tinted prescription glasses, Kritchikorn has only been in Australia for 4 months, but has decided to apply for permanent residency once he graduates from university. He's fallen in love with Australia, he gushes to his mother and sister in frequent letters back home. What he hasn't told them is that as a gay man, Australia is a place where he can be his authentic self, something he could never do back in his home village in northern Thailand. After finishing his shift, Kritchikorn is in the mood for company, but a taxi fare to and from the gay bars of Oxford Street will set him back more than a third of tonight's wage. And besides, he's still learning English and finds it difficult to communicate in the din and distractions of the bars. So he crosses the road to the headland, passes the Bondi icebergs into the darkness of the pathway. It's now after midnight. No one is about. Perhaps the cold has deterred everyone, and Kritchikorn reaches Mackenzie's Point, the pointy part of the headland where a large rock ledge pokes out over the ocean. In the moonlight, Kritchikorn makes out a thin, 30-something man sitting on a low circular wall gazing out to sea. The man sitting on the rock wall smiles at Kritchikorn and introduces himself as Geoffrey Sullivan. The pair chat amiably for quite a while, Kritchikorn in his broken English, Geoffrey in his Aussie twang, against the din of the waves below. Suddenly, 3 men come storming out of the bushes on the slight hill opposite. Geoffrey Sullivan grabs Kritchikorn's arm and says, "Run." But there's nowhere for them to escape, trapped as they are between the sea and the pathway skirting the headland. Sean McAuliffe roars at Geoffrey Sullivan to give up his jacket and money.
Use your jacket and your money! I'll kill you! Hurry up! Come on!
But McAuliffe lays into him with a claw hammer. Ribs crack, blood vessels burst. Kritchikorn, only a few metres away, is desperately trying to fend off a volley of blows from David McAuliffe and Matthew Davis as they take turns to pin him down and punch and kick him. Then there's a changeover. Sean McAuliffe punches and kicks Kritchikorn while Matthew Davis holds him up. Breathing heavily and crying in agony, Kritchikorn stumbles along the cliff edge. There, he either slips over the edge or is pushed. Trying desperately to get a grip as he falls, Kritchikorn claws so violently at a jagged piece of rock that he leaves his blood-stained palm prints all over it. Nearby, Sullivan is lying in a pool of his own blood. The next morning, two locals, a gay man and his partner, see fresh bloodstains over the stairs and rocks, with further splotches of red near the cliff edge. One of the men walks to the cliff edge, lies down, leans over and calls out. There is no answer. Out of sight, Kritchikorn lies on a ledge below for several hours, drifting in and out of consciousness, leaving evidence of vomit and blood behind him and a letter from his mum tucked into a small nook in the rock face. At some point, Kritchikorn falls down to a second ledge where he remains for some time. He's almost certainly still alive when he falls into the water and drowns. It's possible that had the police called emergency services first thing on the Saturday, they may have found Kritchikorn alive. Although police officers are on the scene by 8 a.m, the investigation does not get underway until the Sunday. 2 keys on a ring and a man's watch with a broken wristband are found on the rock wall where Kritchikorn and Jeffrey had been chatting. Kritchikorn's prescription glasses are lying on the grass and pieces of plastic ID belonging to Jeffrey are scattered across the top of the stairs. When police later track Jeffrey down to his flat, he's in shock and requires medical attention. He explains to them that after he regained consciousness, he staggered home and fell on the bed. He'd been kicked with such force that the imprint of the sole of a shoe had been left on his cheek. He tells the police he doesn't know what happened to Kritchikorn. The murder makes the evening news on the Monday, after Kritchikorn's body is found by police divers.
Police have identified the dead man as a Thai national who arrived in Australia 4 months ago. Detectives believe he had been brutally bashed before he either fell or was tossed over the cliff. An autopsy has revealed the man suffered several blows to the head. Blood found on top of the cliff is also undergoing forensic tests.
Something snapped within the gay community after the murder of Kritchikorn. Paul Symes, a Bondi local who'd been living in the area for over 30 years within easy walking distance of Marks Park, recalls the impact the murder had on him.
I just felt really aware and gutted by his murder, and it sort of haunted me, the thought of, how he must have felt at the time before it all happened. With Ross Warren, there was a sort of a celebrity quality to it, and perhaps at that time I might have been busy and I just didn't perhaps pay as much attention, but certainly with Kritchikorn I can remember all of that emotion. Most particularly, I recall with Kritchikorn there was something about the vulnerability and the thought that someone from Thailand had come here, maybe not as aware of the dangers, minding his own business, doing what we were all doing, but perhaps not being as tuned into the dangers because he was not a local.
Kritchikorn Rattanajurathaporn's murder is merely the latest in a grisly roll call of murders across Sydney. William Allen, a 51-year-old former teacher, attacked on December 28, 1988 in Alexandria Park. Allen managed to stagger home where he died from his injuries. Richard Johnson, a handsome 33-year-old office worker from New Zealand, slaughtered by 8 teenagers in 1990 in the same spot as William Allen. Wayne Tonks, a 32-year-old teacher at Cleveland Street Boys High in Redfern, murdered in his apartment in Artarmon on May 19, 1990. Maurice McCarty, a 53-year-old technician for the Australian Ballet, murdered in his home in April 1991. Crispin Dye, former manager of the rock band AC/DC, murdered in Little Oxford Street in December 1993. And Raymond Keane, a 43-year-old main roads technician and martial artist, as well as father of a 2-year-old son, murdered in Allison Park in January 1987. More than 35 years after Keane's death, Raymond's son, made an emotional plea for information on the murder of his father, following a $1 million reward offered by the New South Wales government and police.
There isn't a day that goes by that I don't think about the cowards that brutally attacked and murdered him.
Raymond Keane was assaulted in the early hours of the 13th of January 1987. He had a black belt in karate, which led police to believe more than one person was involved, but no one has ever been charged. A mystery which has haunted his son Dane, who was just 3 years old at the time.
As a gay man myself, it was hard to read. And it, not just what happened to my father, but happened to all the other men in that area at that time.
By mid-1990, with the violence escalating, Sydney's LGBTQ community had had enough. A sea of angry protesters filled Macquarie Street in front of State Parliament. Activists splattered red paint over 11 city buildings, including State Parliament, the Downing Centre Court Complex, the headquarters of Channel 10 and the Sydney Morning Herald. Posters were pinned up nearby, proclaiming, "Our blood runs in the streets, in the parks, in the casualty wards and in the morgue. We're over it. Stop violence against gay men now." The Golden Gay Mile of Oxford Street was another hotspot, and not just around the bars, nightclubs and restaurants. A gay man was brutally bashed only 5 doors down from the office of local councillor Clover Moore. No matter how much the police presence has increased, Moore told the Sun Herald newspaper, the violence is continuing. It's horrific. Even though bashings were regularly occurring across Melbourne as well, Sydney had become the gay murder capital of Australia. Paul Symes, the Bondi resident who we heard from earlier in this episode, proved to be a saviour in the case of a gay bashing in Moore Park.
It was a cold night and I paused in my car and thought, will I go in or won't I go in? And so I just sort of stopped for a moment. Then I saw this car heading in the other direction pull up very fast on the other side of the road, and guys hopped out of it. And they were just explosive in their activity, and they were pumped and just so energetic. It instantly reminded me of A Clockwork Orange. The boot flew up at the back, and one guy started handing out batons, and they all grabbed them and they ran into the park. And it was cinematically horrifying. And I thought, I can't leave. I can't see anyone, but I better stay here and see what happens because I'm safe in my car. A guy came running out of the park and jumped down onto South Dowling Street. And I could see this group of guys behind him. And he ran onto the footpath 10 or 15 metres in front of me and tripped in the gutter and fell over, which gave these guys the opportunity to catch him, and they just started beating him with these planks of wood and batons, and they were not aware that I was there at that stage. So I thought, what can I do? I can't get out of the car. So I started the car up and put my headlights on and just stayed there with the headlights on, and they were obviously aware of me because they were bathed in headlight, and they did nothing. They just kept beating him. They were oblivious to my presence, or well, perhaps they weren't oblivious, but they were not going to stop because I was there. So I drove slowly past them and did a U-turn over the grass median strip, which of course is no longer there because the Eastern distributor goes through there now. And I pulled up behind the car that they'd got out of, and I thought this should get them to stop, and they still were beating this guy. So I took down the number plate of the car with a piece of paper and a pen that I fortunately was able to find in my dirty car. Looking across, they're still beating this guy. So I thought, what can I do? It's before mobile phones. So I drove off and went looking for a working telephone box. I would guess I had to go to 3 boxes to find one that worked to ring the police and report this assault. After I reported the assault, I then drove back to South Dowling Street to where the assault had happened to see if there was anything, to see if there was someone there that needed assistance.
The victim that night was a man called Alan Rosendale.
I was taken by ambulance to St Vincent's Hospital.
Alan suffered broken teeth, a broken nose, and extensive soft tissue injuries, so much so that he was unrecognisable.
A guy that I worked with at the time came in once he heard that I was there, and he didn't recognise me. He brought me a present. He said, "I'll just leave this here for you and I'll go. I just can't cope with how you look." I think he turned white once he saw me.
Locals in the 1980s never doubted that the Bondi headland was a violent place at night, but the vast majority of assaults were never reported to police. One of the attacks on the headland during this time was a bizarre sexual assault.
So there were males in their 20s. There was 3 of them. The victim in that matter, he's since deceased. He was lured to a discreet bushland location on that headland under the pretext of having sex with another male. When he was there, he had 2 guys approach him, and I think he believed they were undressed at the time. They bashed him for being gay, and they raped him as well. You're abusing him for being involved in male-on-male sexual relationships, but then you have sex with him yourself, and I just don't get that. But there was an element of torture involved. They were burning him with lighters. It was one of the nastiest rape stories that I'd heard.
Against the background of the gay hate murder spree and police inaction or indifference was the growing AIDS epidemic.
There were terms like the gay plague and gay cancer appearing every day in mainstream media outlets that really created a huge amount of stigma and discrimination that was targeted towards our community, particularly gay men. And I think a lot of that was exacerbated in Sydney at the time as well, because it really was the epicentre of the epidemic.
That's Nick Parkhill, the CEO of ACON. The now notorious Grim Reaper advertising campaign on TV, designed to raise awareness of the spread of HIV/AIDS, resulted in a backlash against the gay community.
At first, only gays and IV drug users were being killed by AIDS. But now we know every one of us could be devastated by it.
But what it really did was create a backlash towards gay men and particularly people living with HIV. And that led into fear and stigma and discrimination that was really targeted towards gay people. That unintended consequence of the Grim Reaper is still something that we're living with today. In the early 90s, certainly up until when combination antiretroviral drug treatment became available, the average life expectancy for someone who'd been diagnosed with an AIDS diagnosis was approximately 1 year. It's possibly difficult, I think, for young people today to understand the level of devastation that was being experienced by not just the gay community here in Sydney, but gay communities across the world, and the loss that was being experienced and the grief that was being experienced.
Nicholas Parkhill had a very personal reason for joining ACON in the mid-1990s.
So I came to work at ACON, but at around the same time in 95, 96, my brother had just been diagnosed with HIV. That was before combination treatment was available. I was very, very scared. And that, I think, was very much a motivation for me to come and work at ACON.
Nicholas had his own scary brush with violence sweeping through Sydney at the time.
So it would have been the late 90s, and I'd been drinking on a Friday night with some friends, including my partner. It was probably about 11 o'clock, and we were leaving, my partner and I, along with a good friend of ours. My partner and my friend, they'd both gotten in the back seat of the car, and I was getting into the front seat of the taxi, leaving the pub, the Beecham. And as I was getting in, there were about 3 or 4 guys that tried to drag me out of the taxi, out of the front seat. And I was pulling it shut, and the taxi driver sort of drove off, which allowed me to slam the door and get into the taxi completely.
After several months of preliminary investigative work, Detective Sergeant Steve Page is given the green light to launch an investigation into the murder of newsreader Ross Warren and barman John Russell. It will be codenamed Operation Taradale. After Page opens the file on the slaying of Kritchikorn Rattanajurathaporn in July 1990 and puts aside the crime scene photographs, amongst the most grisly and sickening he's ever seen, he examines the post-mortem report. It concludes that even had Kritchikorn survived, he would most likely have been left with severe brain damage and perhaps paraplegia. Page was impressed that at least Kritchikorn's life was awarded something the deaths of Ross Warren and John Russell weren't: a skilled murder investigation. 3 elements made this investigation different. First, a tip-off. The mother of a teenage boy overheard Matthew Davis bragging to her son about murdering what he called a Chinaman after she had read about the crime in the newspaper. Second, a witness, Jeffrey Sullivan, survived to have his day in court and testify against his attempted murderers. Third, a competent investigation was led by Detective Sergeant Steve McCann from Waverley Police, not Bondi Police, as was the case with Warren and Russell. Matthew Davis was arrested less than a month after the attack, and the McAuliffe brothers a few days after that. The McAuliffe brothers, who pleaded not guilty, were each convicted of murder and sentenced to 20 years jail, with a minimum of 12 years, while Matthew Davis, who pleaded guilty, was sentenced to 19 years with a minimum term of 11 years. Page is interested to read, however, that while they were in jail, Davis complained that the McAuliffe brothers had put the dog on him for being a police informer. He claimed to be the victim of a stabbing attempt and various episodes of violent threats. In a sworn statement, Davis admitted to having joined the McAuliffes in at least a dozen bashings of gay men, mostly at Moore Park and Centennial Park. Chillingly, however, Davis recalled David McAuliffe telling him about another murder at the clifftops before the death of Rattanajurathaporn. It wasn't unusual at this time for offenders to claim the gay panic defence, a legal strategy in which they claimed a moment of violent temporary insanity following a sexual overture from a gay man, or they claimed to confuse homosexuality with pedophilia.
You've got others that have got motives where they've got a misguided hatred of pedophiles, and they just can't see the difference between a gay male and a pedophile male. So certainly in the case of the Thai national Kritchikorn, one offender in his matter was able to say later that he was a victim of child abuse and just couldn't separate the two.
After Page uses a dummy to stage a dramatic reenactment of John Russell's fall over the clifftop, the ensuing stories on TV, radio and the newspapers result in a small wave of phone calls and leads that continue for some weeks.
The idea was trying to find witnesses and bring them forward and really generate some media attention. There was another body that I had to investigate, and that was the death of Gil Mataney. His then partner, Jacques Musi, called me, just said, "Look, I saw the news. I need to tell you that my partner went missing in 1985. We were living in Bondi, and he was gay."
At Page's invitation, Jacques Musi comes into Paddington Police Station. In a thick French accent, he explains how he spent over 17 years agonising about what happened to his former lover. Gilles was a French national, a diminutive, shortish man weighing no more than 60 kilos, still boyish in the face at 27, with light brown hair and bright, twinkly eyes. He worked at the Menzies Hotel in the city, and the pair had been together for nearly 7 years, having met in a Paris nightclub in the winter of 1978. A long-cherished dream for the pair was to live in a warm climate near a beach, and so, in March 1984, Gilles flew into Sydney, joining Jacques, who'd come to Australia some months earlier to organise a job and accommodation. Over takeaway fish and chips in Bondi one night, Gilles told Jacques he'd never been happier. On Friday, August 16, 1985, Jacques boarded a plane to Paris for a 5-week visit to family and old friends. Jacques called Gilles at least twice a week while he was away. The last contact Gilles had with any of his friends in Sydney was on the morning of September 15, 1985. At 3 p.m. the following day, Gilles did not turn up for his 8-hour shift at the Menzies Hotel. A friend of Gilles and Jacques, Ottaviani, who also worked at the Menzies, was immediately concerned as this was so out of character for Gilles. He called the flat 3 times and went over the next morning and pounded on the door. He phoned mutual friends, the hospital, the police station. Nothing. Then he called Jacques in Paris, who boarded the next flight he could get back to Sydney. Jacques explains to Page that when he got to the flat in Ramsgate Avenue, there was no sign of forced entry. Everything was in its usual place. All valuables were intact. On the coffee table sat Gilles' wallet, which he always left behind when he went on one of his seaside walks. There was no sign of a note. The first thing Jacques noticed when he picked through Gilles' wardrobe was that his Walkman and spray jacket were missing, as were his runners, a sloppy Joe, and a pair of sweatpants. He'd clearly gone for a walk. Jacques frantically contacted everyone and every institution he could think of, including the French consulate, learning the hard way that when it comes to missing people, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack. Ottaviani had already lodged a missing persons report with the Bondi police, but he never heard back. As his investigation advances, Page organises for hidden listening devices to be put into the jail cells of the murderers of Kritchikorn Rattanajurathaporn.
Bragging, for want of a better term, of this as a sport and a blood sport.
Page also obtained recordings of the bugged conversations of the murderers of Richard Johnson, organised by his predecessor, Detective Steve McCann, in the mid-90s. Like the Rattanajurathaporn killing, the Johnson murder was one of the very few at the time to result in a conviction and jail time for the murderers.
What we were able to establish was that, particularly in the group that were involved in the killing of Richard Johnson, which I referred to along the way as the Alexandria 8, they were luring gays and just treating it as a blood sport. It was just brutal fun for them.
Following the reconstruction of John Russell's fall on the Bondi cliffs, Page is contacted by other witnesses to the violence in the late 1980s. But one man stands out. A man who narrowly escaped with his life after being brutally bashed and dragged to the very cliff edge only a month after John Russell was killed. A man who had stared death in the eye for 10 terrifying minutes at the same spot the barman was thrown over. Page hopes he has the ultimate witness, the man who got away.
Next time on Bondi Badlands.
And then they surprised me, bashed me and dragged me some distance where they were going to throw me off a cliff, which is the same place they threw another person off.
There was quite a few teenagers that were in it, and a mix of boys and girls. Some were of Caucasian background, others were Islander background, and he's been grabbed, dragged up to a spot, and those words were said to him, let's throw him off where we threw off the other one.
An earlier version of this episode stated that Mr. Jeffrey Sullivan died. This was incorrect, and we apologise for the error.
Bondi Badlands is sponsored by Waverley Council and ACON, a New South Wales-based health promotion organisation specialising in community health, inclusion and HIV responses for people of diverse sexualities and genders. Special thanks to our podcast guests Nick Parkhill, Stephen Page, Alan Rosendale and Paul Symes. Special thanks to Michael Atkinson, formerly of ACON. Bondi Badlands is based on the book of the same name by Greg Callaghan, who narrates the podcast. Original theme and podcast production by Ian Cuthbertson. Extracts from Crime Investigation Australia's Blood Sport, The Bondi Gay Murders, used with permission. If this podcast has raised issues for you, contact Lifeline on 131114 or Beyond Blue on 1300 224636.